Kirbys Dreamland got a mesmerizing follow-up less than a year after its release. Just the fact that this teeny tiny game ended up with a new entry that was this sizable is an underdog story in Nintendo IP history that never ceases to amaze. And I think you have to consider the unique position of that original game to really appreciate that. Kirby's debut in 1992 wasn't just different from the Nintendo norm, it was actively riding the undercurrent of popular action gaming on home consoles and beyond. Nintendo stars, both first and third party, were escalating, offering greater scopes, longer playtimes, and ample challenges than their last entries, pioneering standards, and racing alongside the rigorous pace of other developers and what they could pull off with the hardware. But Dreamland forgoed this race, and was exclusive to the Game Boy, not the evergreen Nintendo Entertainment System or the fresh next-gen tech of the Super Nintendo. It was a side-scroller made for beginners, and not that surging hardcore crowd. It was programmed under some pretty constrained and frankly amateur methods. Director Masahiro Sakurai would reveal that while Dreamland was designed on a twin Famicom, a pretty typical dev kit for game making that anyone had retail access to, it was also put together with nothing less than an on-screen keyboard and a frickin' trackball cursor. And Sakurai at the time thought that that was just how people were making games, not with an orthodox mouse or physical keyboard or anything. Psh. And it was marketed with a conspicuously cuddly art style that Japanese advertising gladly embraced, while Western advertising pretty much felt embarrassed by.
Alright, so later in the show we're going to be meeting someone vaguely interesting, but first, here's a big fat balloon-like creature. The kids think he's great, but I have never heard of him. Kirby!
Looking at it from those ways, Kirby seemed out of touch with the zeitgeist. But I also think that it was because of those factors, because of its lack of competition, its confidence in its cartoony look, and its construction on an apparatus so outlandish that you really have no choice but to concentrate on how carefully you make it, that the actual game turned out so good. Dreamland may have been a game you could beat in 20 minutes, but within that span, players were treated to a one-of-a-kind, action-packed side-scroller with a ton of mobility, loving production, and surprising value. A handheld classic by all accounts. But let's be real, as flexible, well-produced, and valuable as this game was, it wasn't exactly contemporary. Dreamland on the downscaled, monochromatic Game Boy could only derive, sample, and be a worthy alternative to the best of 2D action on the NES. It was an approachable game, but that beginner's audience it was made for, and the hardcore crowd that it briefly caught the attention of, were gonna move on from it soon. Sakurai himself recognized this at the time when he received suggestions to direct a port of Kirby's Dreamland for the NES. The game itself was more than appropriate on Game Boy, but so much more was needed to justify being on a console. And so the following year of 1993, Kirby made his console debut and rightfully gained the production and platform to make those dreams happen. But it didn't go for an ambitious premiere on Nintendo's 16-bit powerhouse. Kirbys Adventure was a late NES title, but the NES was still selling and home to a universal amount of owners. It arrived just before the console was signing off and thus stood in for nearly 8 years of quality action gaming experience on the platform. But at the same time, Kirbys Adventure had to revamp the beginner's action game into a deluxe NES action game. A straightforward task on paper, but HAL Laboratory couldn't just leave behind its original audience. The action of Kirby was going to rise, but all of that effort was now going to be focused on directions almost unheard of for the NES, but very familiar to that character. And so this stylish retrospective on Kirbys Adventure will explore the results, what it improved, what it innovated, and what it ultimately managed to say about Kirby's future as a series and the very platform it was retiring. It's time to chase higher dreams, or nightmares I guess. Let's we go, amigo! I think the remnants of that original pitch to port Kirby's Dreamland to the NES can still be identified here, because nearly all of its sprite work and fundamentals are still present. Kirby can still inhale enemies and objects and spit them out as stars. He can still hover across levels. He can still let out a lethal puff of air from that hover. and he still ducks down to attack whatever falls beneath him. This is still the same delightfully unbounded avatar, now with a wider field of view, and the Technicolor to properly envision it. What were once forgiving properties that alleviated constraints of the Game Boy screen can now be appreciated as inherent traits of a really fun character to control. A character that can fly effortlessly and shoot across the screen, practically begging to be depicted on a TV screen. And now that Kirby's on the NES, it's even more apparent how he stands apart from other gravity-bounded, strict-jumping avatars that were still making their appearances on the platform. Kirby on a smaller screen was limited to walking, but Adventure lets him dash by tapping twice in a direction. This naturally fits the longer level layouts that Adventure now features, but it also complements a new subtle addition to the level design: slopes. Kirby will have a tougher time going uphill, but will slip down freely when going downhill. Dashing helps to conquer steeper areas, but dashing down a slope has a unique speed to it, and jumping from a dash on a slope keeps some surprising air momentum. Kirby also has this new natural ability where he slides by pressing down in a button. It attacks enemies and obstacles without breaking speed or causing harm, and when performing it off a cliff, Kirby once again gets a unique burst of falling speed. Now, this isn't a platformer that used momentum or speed as its selling point. I'm pretty sure these effects are just incidental to adding things like a dash or slopes to the engine, but still, it caught me by surprise just how much fun it is to move around and casually speedrun. At least it's easy to appreciate when the game isn't slowing down every few minutes, but the point stands. Dreamland thrived on the minimalism of its mechanics, and while Adventure preserves that foundation, the additions it makes on top of it, and their potential for excellent gameplay, brilliantly promote a greater level of control and capability. Which brings us to the most comprehensive addition here, the copy abilities. Dreamland is home to a variety of waddling and magical enemies, and the latter can now be inherited as a power-up. A Waddle-Doo with a wavy beam trying to get in your way can be inhaled and consumed to give Kirby that same beam, to wipe out enemies with a wider window. A Flamer darting across the screen can be snatched to give Kirby the Fireball ability, letting him blast through enemies with a heated hitbox. Grab a Blade Knight for a swift close-range sword, nap Sir Kittle to get a boomerang, don a helmet made of needles, or freeze foes in place and kick them midair. Recall that in the original game, enemies and bosses could be dominated with one reliable trick, but that ran the risk of being repetitive and limiting, to the point that you couldn't properly deal with fast enemies or flocks of enemies with inhaling alone. So the game opted for screen-clearing items made to dominate these harder moments, which felt pretty reductive, as if to say the character could only handle tough sequences with a trick that couldn't be applied anywhere else. But Kirby's Adventure doesn't hesitate in this regard. There are 24 copy abilities to get, and enemies with them are readily available, all across the levels, right from the start of a level, and even before starting a level. This is it right here. This is the kind of overhaul that can open up the floodgates in your mind of what could be done with Kirby now, giving so many powers to the character and so many chances to get those powers. The world isn't just your buffet this time around, it's your goddamn battlefield. In 1993, there was no other side-scrolling action game that felt more gratifying, more freeform, and more mechanically diverse than Kirby's Adventure. In other words, completely and utterly uncharacteristic of the NES, the platform of raw action avatars and uncompromising gauntlets. The console that once said to your face that you couldn't beat them. One that birthed a generation of phone hotlines, magazine support columns, and hyperbolic video game rage content. And the game that stood at its finish line ended up not conforming to any of these standards. Make no mistake, Kirby was already a pretty unparalleled avatar, and the NES did further influence him when he dropped. The mobility has gotten greater, and the powers he can grab are unprecedented in their quantity and potential. But levels and enemies haven't really scaled with it, and still come off as pretty lax. There are tough sections and stage gimmicks that immediately test your skill, but very sparingly so. The journey now consists of consecutive worlds with individual levels, so there is something close to a conventional difficulty curve here, but it's definitely not as fluent as a Mario approach, and certainly not a nail-biting Contra campaign. The vast majority of Kirby's Adventure expands on the type of levels from Dreamland, aquarium-like stretches divided into rooms, with enemies acting as innocent passerbys or collateral, rather than intentional pieces of a highly concentrated obstacle course. Even the ability system, for as expansive as it seems on paper, restrains itself from overwhelming the adventure. Powers aren't permanent or equipable to some inventory. Whatever power you choose to inhale is the one you're forced to keep, and getting hit just once extracts it from Kirby immediately. You may not reach a customizable high between the 24 abilities, but the game encourages you to cherry pick whatever is available, weaving you in and out of abilities, where by the end you've pretty much taste tested all of them. Forget being a sampler of NES action, Kirby's Adventure's gameplay flow is literally about sampling. So this game isn't really old school hard by these metrics. It's not a brutal action game akin to the legacy of the NES, but it's also not transparently easy like Dreamland. I struggle to call it a power fantasy that snaps into every waking minute. So what exactly do we have here? Well, this may not be Kirby reaching some typical or higher pedigree of side-scrolling action, but it is the start of a much more versatile approach to making an action game, an approach far beyond what the NES stood for, a game design philosophy coined by Sakurai years later, and one that I believe would influence Nintendo game making in the long term. Kirbyism, which I feel that there's been some general misconceptions about. Typical criticism you hear about the series is that Kirby games are too easy. The way the games have been marketed and released would have you believe that Kirby games are purely for newbies, while hardcore gamers just gotta stoop to its level to find some enjoyment. I mean, if the latter was true, then I'd sure look like a chump making YouTube videos about these games, huh? No, the concept of Kirbyism, as quoted by Sakurai, is to create a game that could be played differently by any person, the way they would want to. The game is designed with one difficulty that isn't too demanding, but is malleable enough to be achieved with a variety of options. I've already mentioned how flexible the movement can be. You could take a stroll through levels, you could dash and slide across them, or you could hover away from all of it. You never had to commit to one mode of play, and copy abilities demonstrate a similar level of diversity, tackling enemy patterns with spammable long range or careful close range, approaching falling sections with Kirby's natural headbutt, or using Spark as a plummeting barrier, or Rock as a fierce ground pound, rotating the butter building by maintaining your dash, or grabbing a wheel ability and riding it out. You won't be able to experience all of these possibilities in one run, but that's the beauty of it. This is the sheer replayability of Kirby's Adventure, the room to try out new things, experiment better or worse options towards victory, and knowing that playing these levels again can be different and more interesting than your last. It's why the copy abilities mostly boil down to one or two standard moves to their execution. They may initially feel like novelty toys that aren't intrinsically deep, but like the appeal of toys, you get a feel for how fine-tuned they can be to whatever environment you choose to juxtapose them in. You start to notice these little tactile traits about them, like how the cutter ability can attack anything behind you if you jump over the boomerang, or how the laser ability can reflect off slopes, or how throw and suplex have unique commands for every button. Enemies with umbrellas would have a lot of aerial coverage in levels, but inhaling them and gaining the parasol ability not only gives Kirby a front-facing umbrella strike, but can also let him glide with smooth horizontal momentum, and gives him a protective shield against anything that lands above it. Even when you're just standing around, it's nifty. You'll come across wacky, one-of-a-kind enemies like a living, breathing ball and a quick zooming spaceship. Seizing the opportunity to inhale them lends you some extremely rare and flat-out busted abilities. The UFO serves as a higher-end form of the primary beam ability that can now charge attacks and move at any direction super fast. And Ball is a testament to how much more prominent the physics are in this entry, and can be especially lethal against mid-bosses. Enemies may all go down in one hit, but the game is now filled with mini-bosses, each with their own unique amount of health, and this is where the damage output of distinct copy abilities come into play. Projectile-based powers generally give good coverage and can deal attacks quickly, but weapon-based attacks encourage you to get closer for comparatively better damage. Hammer and Parasol are especially wicked, but have an even closer range. The strike of the Parasol in particular has a distinct frame between the forward strike and the skyward hold. that can act as a multiplier of damage when aiming it correctly. High risk of getting hit, but high reward for landing attacks at the right sweet spot. Dreamland's boss fights were the most well thought out sector of that game, and Adventure doubles down on them. I guess you could argue that bosses have been watered down to menial damage sponges compared to their more thoughtful approaches in the original game. I mean, look at what happened to Wispy Woods here, going from a boss that at least made you work for hits to an exposed wall that gets eviscerated with literally any copy ability. These fights do bring Kirby closer to the sort of contemporary boss fights you'd find on the NES, but they're far from endurances where you're scraping away at health. They're neat little skirmishes, where the technical finesse of whatever ability you arrive with can unfold. And it's the self-imposed options of the game's combat that elevates the game as a whole. There may be objectively more ideal ways to perform levels and win fights. There may be obvious copy ability tiers, but ultimately, anything can be viable to beat this game, and you get to decide how close to that paragon, or even how far off from it, you want to be. To give you a better picture of just how valid even the most primitive of gameplay approaches can be in Kirby's Adventure, we have to look at one of my personal favorite abilities. That's right, I'm of course referring to Dreamland's Starspit. Now, you would think that an innovation like the copy ability system would completely replace Kirby's original tactic of snatching and dispatching, or overshadow it at the very least. But if anything, it lives up to its return better than ever here. So when you're fighting bosses without a copy ability, you can still deal damage to them with that old-fashioned Dreamland tact, by reading their movements and waiting for them to release inhalable objects or stars from their wildest attacks. And the damage done to them is nothing to scoff at. Like in the Game Boy game, mid-bosses and bosses can go down in a handful of carefully aimed hits. So if you're like me and found a lot of merit in Dreamland's boss fights, where you'd weave around your opponent and target them at the clearest moments, this is a justifiably effective way to fight them, the safest and smartest way in my books, and also one that's painted as a great failsafe. Losing a copy ability reverts it into a bouncing runaway star that you can inhale to retrieve your ability again, or you can sacrifice it in favor of dishing out a large chunk of damage right then and there. There's even a button to revert any ability into a bouncing star on command. It complements the copy abilities pretty well in that regard. Beginners can start strong with the spit attack and learn to fixate themselves on the nuances of copy abilities. And while action game veterans will naturally be drawn to copy abilities, losing them and realizing the strengths of snatching and dispatching will show them just how strong the character is, even without any enhancement. Take these sections for example. On a few occasions, this mysterious knight will summon his cavalry of minions, and these are the few durable enemies in Kirby's Adventure, so copy abilities actually turn out to be the most difficult way to fend them off. But luckily, they're still bite-sized, so inhaling them does wonders in taking them out in one fell swoop, and spitting them out to other enemies finishes them instantly. I love this. And I think even if it doesn't sound too practical to your personal taste, you can't help but appreciate that it has the potential to accomplish this much when it's put into good use. Kirby's Adventure is a game that embodies the concept of the whole being more than the sum of its parts. It cherishes that original game's systems and repurposes them into a modern asset, recontextualizing the only move Kirby ever had into a power that is just as practical and devastating as every new copy ability. It shows how newer, modest gamers can enjoy the game and pose their own challenges as much as veteran, more skill-savvy gamers. This is really it right here. This is the kind of overhaul that can open up the floodgates in your mind of what could be done with gaming after the NES era. Sakurai made it a point to distinguish his Kirbyism from classic Nintendoism, games with immediate, escalating challenges overcome by characters with a set amount of skills, the core of the NES's old-school reputation and hardcore audience. And while it proved its worth in history with its retroactive enjoyment from gamers today and its copious amount of throwbacks, Sakurai and Kirby dug deeper into the one facet that NES action had always compromised: the user experience. It's why Kirby's Adventure is noteworthy for its malleable combat and platforming options. It's why it features battery saves for a game that wasn't a top-down adventure or RPG. and on top of that, having autosaving present throughout the whole journey. It's why the game paces the adventure with navigable hub areas, giving you nice stress-free zones away from the main levels, but ones that also retain all of Kirby's playability, essentially functioning as makeshift labs to get a feel for Kirby's controls, and especially experiment with copy abilities without any obligations. It's why each of these hubs offer free copy abilities in museums and arena battles, and a Warp Star station that ties all of it together. Make a trip to Vegetable Valley for a free sword, or Ice Cream Island for laser or fire, or partake in a mini-boss to get to max health. It's why the game indulges you in bonus rooms that provide even more morale and escapism. These are mini-games to accumulate extra lives that also act as these intimate vignettes for Kirby, like little stage plays, where you get to see a more carefree side of the world and cast for some wholesome entertainment. Aw, the crane wasn't strong enough to lift the big Kirby. Aw, he ate a bunch of eggs and gave birth to some chirps. And oh my god, why does DDD require such point-blank timing for the cowboy minigame? Jeez! I wanna gorge myself on this sense of fulfillment till I vomit. It's why the game is great for completionists. The hub areas clue you in on certain bonus rooms being locked out, unless you find a hidden switch in one of its main levels. I guess they are akin to the cryptic puzzles you'd find on the NES, but not nearly as severe. It's really just a matter of pointing out inconsistencies with the levels to find them, or in the best cases, using copy ability combos to reach them. Some that require you to be fast on your feet, and others where the solution isn't immediately available. So take this moment here. I encounter some blocks in an underwater section that I can't immediately break. I think maybe that I can use the stone ability to ground pound them, but that's not viable underwater. But then I recall that weapon-based abilities like sword, parasol, and in this case hammer, can be used while swimming. So I backtrack to get myself a hammer, replay the level, and crack the code for good. You could argue that completion is pointless and redundant, since all it really does is unlock rooms that you already had access to from the start that are just now being arbitrarily locked away from you. Maybe you don't need them at all because you can handle yourself just fine in the game, seeing how it already showers you with extra lives as it stands. And to that I say, yeah, that's totally valid. I've played this game a bunch of times before and for this video, and I certainly don't feel the need to solve every puzzle and unlock every bonus room in subsequent playthroughs. But the fact is, you can if you want to, and when you do, you're learning more about the copy ability system and the construction of levels. Even if the rewards aren't eye-catching for a veteran, isn't it cool that newer players who choose to engage more with the game get more chances to be better at it? I'd imagine it's especially gratifying for them in worlds like Orange Ocean, where every bonus room is hidden and every main level has a switch to find. It's a nice difficulty approach for a late game world, besides just making the levels harder. And hey guys, check that out. The doors are even tinted to let you know if you're missing a hidden switch or not. And there's even a completion tracker on the save select. What a concept for an NES game, huh? And lastly, it's why the aesthetics and music on display here immediately grab your attention. Kirbys Dreamland was a very clean, plushy, and lively looking Game Boy game. And one of its artistic strengths was in how approximate it was to its hand-drawn source material, even if it was in shrunken down, desaturated vision. But Kirbys Adventure brings its graphics even closer to its source with the power of color. And unlike the darker, rich color palettes or complementary choices you'd find across the NES, the best way I can describe the presentation here is confectionery. This game looks like a delectable treat and sounds like it's tickled with joy. The color choices are as primary or surreal as the wildest yet comfiest of imaginations. The stages can be as pleasantly appealing as gourmet desserts on display, and the music is filled with these complex notes, effortless harmonies, and even exciting transitions. I also want to shout out the environments, which feel remarkably close to reality, but with that fairy tale touch to them. Mountains and waterfalls, tall rotating towers, bouncing around the roofs of castles, or making your way through a parade of blimps in the sky. HAL was inspired by iconic sightseeing locations, the kind of places that reach out to your heart. And rather than just mapping a level conventionally, an artist was hired to draw these backgrounds first, and then became mapped into an 8-bit conversion. Mwah. Kirby's Adventure is a game that feels like it shouldn't be for the NES, but that's because of how much it outright schools the platform when it comes to personalized difficulty options and a lavish user experience. The perfect swan song for the system's retirement. Now, challenge never left action gaming in the 16-bit era and onwards, but what came about were more options, features, better controlling characters and flexibility, reasons to replay and backtrack levels, and overall ease of access. Games may have been getting bigger, but the player experience was rising too. And even going further than Nintendo, the evolution of action gaming would deliver a breadth of options and tactics and modes to overcome any challenge, making you think further about the science of combat, and letting any combination of moves you can piece together in your mind as valid towards your victory. This is exactly what Kirbyism stood for, and why its influence can still be felt throughout all of gaming under Nintendo's umbrella. Which I guess also puts into perspective why Kirby's Adventure is a game that I deeply respect, more than a de facto title that completely won me over. This may have been the birth of Kirbyism, but it's also pretty noticeably its first draft. Being the game that introduced copy abilities means that it has those obligatory sections and even bosses that maximize one particular power, not too much room for fun experimentation there. Also, while plenty of depth in their output, the reality of these powers is that they amount to one move that you spam around enemies and bosses, which still makes Kirby quite a loose cannon. I still can't help but feel that it's really easy to get pushed around, especially when you have to scrutinize a copy ability's solitary move where you risk immediately losing it by getting poked just once. I feel like giving abilities a more robust moveset would tackle hurdles in this game that come across as monotonous or cheap. It would help players learn to love an ability that's out of their comfort zone, so they're not just left thinking that one trick is all an ability is good for. Kirbys Dreamland had a very unique take on a difficulty curve through value, by presenting an easy campaign that clues you in on a much harder playthrough, which clues you in on self-imposed challenges through configurations. Kirby's Adventure does have an extra mode. It's unlocked when you 100% the game, but it's nowhere near as comprehensive or even outrageous. It's just a playthrough of the same adventure where you have a maximum of 3 hit points and you're prohibited from saving. It's a fine enough challenge, but beating that awards you with a sound test. And that's about it. This is where I would have loved to see the configuration screen make a comeback. Imagine a playthrough of Kirby's Adventure where you could not only manipulate health and lives, but maybe even give Kirby one permanent ability throughout the whole game. But as it stands, Kirby's Adventure is an action game that banks on playful variety rather than the thrill of overcoming hurdles. And you know, that's fine. I still totally vibe with Kirbyism and its priority on a choice-driven experience. But I do also believe that a version of it can exist where the player experience can go further, and the design difficulty can pick up the slack too. Part of the reason why I started this series on early Kirby games is not just as a fan of Kirby, but as a fan of action gaming at large. I could readily embrace Kirby's Dreamland for what it was, an easy little action game with lots to sink into, derived from a genre that had and still would be marketed for the hardcore, and that would put me on the hunt for deeper mechanics and challenges. And while the action enthusiast side of me wants to be disappointed at Kirby's Adventure for not being more than it is, I end up getting astonished by all the little bits of depth and incentive it gained that ultimately win me over. I may consider most of the title an above-average stepping stone for Kirby, a mere first draft towards what would be deeper combat and action grounds for the character. But this game definitely sold me on the fact that it had surpassed the expectations of the NES, and that this character was bound to go places. So to close things out, what do you say I walk you through my train of thought on 3 distinct moments of this game's iconic endgame, the parts that really made the game click. Number 1. The boss fight against this new character called Meta Knight. Now, Kirby's Dreamland had a pretty simple story. King DDD was the big bully, sending his army of equally big bullies, and Kirby was the only one determined and absorbent enough to stop his latest scheme with ease. Kirby's Adventure reiterates this setup, but with some new stakes behind it. Instead of stealing sparkling stars and all the food, DDD has gone the extra mile and broken the magical star rod from the Fountain of Dreams, giving a piece to each of his Goonies and consequently ruining the hopes and dreams of everybody in Dreamland. But a new third party joins the conversation, this masquerading knight. Apparently DDD hired him to stop Kirby, and while he will have to face off against his cavalry, he also tends to show up at the midpoint of a stage, offer Kirby some invincible candy at no price, and vanishes Tuxedo Mask style. You end up thinking throughout the game, what exactly is his deal? He should be no different than the cronies that Kirby fights without a second thought. But he follows you relentlessly throughout the whole game, trapping you and helping you in equal parts. Almost like he's testing you, and before the final world, you get to confront him for good. But he doesn't fight right away. He waits for you to pick up the sword ability that he kindly offers, and begins the fight honorably once you do. This is the toughest boss of Kirby's Adventure, and the peak of its challenge. It even surpasses the behavior of DDD's fight from Dreamland. The ability spamming frenzy of other bosses is now a tense fencing match, with the knight lunging and feinting, never really making his patterns entirely clear. Getting greedy for hits rightfully punishes you, but landing hits feel more valuable than ever. It's a shining example of how well they've revamped the combat, and a glimpse of how far it could go in the future. And once you beat him, the mystery unfolds. Kinda. The knight was a puffball just like you. It's no wonder he monitors you throughout the game. He's almost like a big brother of sorts. But we can think about the genetics of Kirby later. Number 2. After finally reaching the last world, Rainbow Resort, after a series of pastel spacey levels, the last level you're tasked to finish is this. Yep, a throwback to Kirbys Dreamland on the Game Boy, in all of its original monochrome glory, backed by the same primitive rendition of the Green Greens theme as you go through pseudo-replications of the exact level designs from that game. Now, I personally have little to no childhood nostalgia for either of these games. I also personally wasn't alive when these games came out in the early 90s. My childhood with Kirby started with much later entries, and remakes for that matter. However, I don't even think nostalgia is the point of this section. Kirby's Adventure wasn't even a year away from Kirby's Dreamland on the Game Boy, and the series had barely begun. There's really no way the game wanted to pay reverential tribute to something that just happened. And while the fight against Meta Knight was the hardest part of the game, this is oddly the easiest level in the game, strikingly simple for a final level, and borderline formulaic if you've already played Dreamland. This kind of moment should fall flat on its face. And yet, it manages to warm my heart every time. And it's not because of fan service, or nostalgia baiting, or even anything relevant to past glory or history. It's because this was the best representation of how far Kirby has come. This may be a low-tier Kirby's Adventure level, but the fact that so much of Kirby's Dreamland could pass off for a Kirby's Adventure level really speaks to how much HAL nailed the level design on their first go. The fun of exploring those layouts on Game Boy is still fresh on the NES, and it's made even more fun to go through with the new additions. You can even bring copy abilities to this level and own it even more. But more than just reliving the memory of Dreamland, this throwback serves as a final assessment for Kirby in the 8-bit era. It's the most vulnerable sign that HAL and Sakurai truly cared about Kirby not just being a one-hit wonder, but a full-on series, dwelling on the past for a brief moment before heading bravely into the future. That future at the moment being the third and final part where the game finally clicked with me. The final boss, where Kirby finally confronts King DDD at the Fountain of Dreams, a fight that parallels his original boxing ring match with a couple new cheeky moves, and the potential to whoop his ass with copy ability combo madness. Down he goes! We got the Star Rod back, and the day is saved. And aw, how pathetic. DDD's really begging for quarter this time around, huh? Well, the cycle of Kirby's justice is just gonna repeat itself like it always does, I guess. We might as well affirm that DDD is still the big dumb bully over his head that he always Whoa. Oh god, Kirby, what have you done? But before he can even think about it, DDD takes advantage of the mayhem, snatches Kirby behind his back, and launches him in its direction. Okay, he's wielding the star rod now. He's up in the skies. What is? Oh! I get it now. This is Nightmare, an evil wizard who is responsible for taking all of the hopes and dreams of Dreamland, sealed within the Fountain of Dreams and unleashed once Kirby collected all of the Star Rod pieces. But even so, Kirby doesn't retreat or reassess the plan. He treats this like any other boss, putting them in their place right here, right now. You fend off its premature orb form in a shoot-'em-up section above the planet, falling into the midst of the clouds. And once you neutralize it, you find your footing, Star Rod in hand, and the fight begins. Nightmare blends in the shadows of the night sky, never staying in one place and being immune to hits with his cape, but finding his exposed body and striking the Star Rod at them will take him out for good. You can do an aerial flip with the Star Rod to easily attack these points, but landing shooting stars or straight up making direct slashes with the Star Rod deal even more damage to him. This is an excellent fight, simple to understand, but with enough strategy and depth to master. With that surprising twist of fate, the game is courteous enough to offer some narrative closure. King Dedede was actually the one who sealed Nightmare by shattering the Star Rod intentionally, and Kirby was actually in the wrong this time around. Now, Dedede is a lot of things. He may be a glutton, and a klutz, and a penguin with anger issues, and maybe it's up in the air to call out Kirby for being no less of a bully than him. In the world of Nintendo, there are good guys and bad guys, and since that first game, Kirby was always painted as the soft-spoken hero, and Dedede the relentless tyrant. But what Adventure goes to show with this revelation is that these two are just ordinary. There's no concrete good guy or bad guy in Dreamland, there are just neighbors and sinister beings beyond their comprehension that threaten their peace. And here, even they make mistakes. They can rightfully bicker and have scores to settle for all of time, but when it comes down to it, they can set aside their differences and help each other out for the greater good. It also explains why Meta Knight wasn't immediately confrontational towards Kirby. It was all a test to see if he could do the right thing at the end. And sure enough, he did. Kirby's Adventure has one of the all-time great plot twists of the NES, and one of its most precious and heartwarming conclusions. Kirby may have made a blunder that nearly ruined everything, but at the end of the day, he really did have a friend to guide him to the right path. And maybe that's all you need to know that he's worthy enough to have more adventures from this point on. In fact, maybe next time, he'll get to have more than one adventure, on a new powerful platform and all on a single cartridge. We'll see just how far they took the formula when next time I look at the final stop of our early Kirby marathon, Kirby Superstar for the Super Nintendo. Happy belated New Year, and here's to more hopes and dreams despite it all. I'll see you soon.